Welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, November 1st, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about Vice President Kamala Harris and her advantages that we've started to see in some recent polling data across the battleground states specific to the Rust Belt, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, and a number of new data points ranging from Arizona to Nevada to Georgia to North Carolina that show her to be in a better position than a week ago that's in an upward direction for the vice president in the final days of the campaign season. We are roughly 4 days out from the 2024 presidential race from being entirely entirely concluded when it comes down to voting. A lot of early voting has already occurred across the United States. Some counties have actually exceeded their 2020 election turnout. And across the board, we have seen a lot of enthusiasm and engagement on both sides of the aisle in this year's presidential election. But Kamala Harris, in a number of battleground states, coming to a point where there has now been an advantage being planted in a way that Kamala Harris might not have been in roughly a week ago. What it shows here is that there have been gains in momentum and trend lines that benefit the vice president that could lead her to victory come in time for the election in a way that's pretty good for the vice president and for her candidacy at large, but also too for down ballot Democrats who are running in Senate elections like in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan and House races all across the nation. Now, I've been watching the polls very closely compared to where they were in 2020, compared to where they are nationally, and it has been a wild ride. Many of these battleground states, when it was Biden versus Trump, had massive leads for the Republican nominee, and then when it came down to Harris versus Trump, it ended up being far more contentious. But never more did Kamala Harris hold a lead of greater than 3 points in any battleground state during the duration of this election cycle. Since she became the presumptive and eventual Democratic nominee, same thing there either. Republicans never had a 3-point lead or higher in any of the battleground states, which means that every single state from July has been within the margin of error to a point that really breaks my brain. It's very unlike any election that we've ever seen to see such states, in fact 7 battleground states, so exceptionally competitive and really just go back and forth and swing in directions that really don't tell us weeks out from the election like they used to in 2018, 2020, 2022, elections that I previously covered on this channel. Everything has thrown us for a whirlwind. But what you do pick up on, especially as you get closer to an election, is how the trend lines show good news or bad news for incumbents, for challengers, for candidates at large. And in the race nationwide, Kamala Harris has started to see some improvements in some battleground states. Now, this first started off when we talked about that poll in Michigan rather. I'm switching up my Rust Belt states here, but Michigan, where in particular Kamala Harris was defeating Donald Trump by roughly 5 points. Now, some new polls out of the state too also show Kamala Harris with a 3-4 point lead across the state, which averages out to her doing better than where she was before. And while she may not be leading in every single poll in states like Michigan, she leads in a way in some of the more high-quality ones and the ones that have historically had a higher percentage of accuracy than some of the recent polls that show Donald Trump doing better than the vice president in the state, and that was a good sign for Kamala Harris. But it was enough for me to discuss it in how it related to Michigan. I made a video on this less than a week ago saying Michigan was slowly becoming the better state for Kamala Harris when evaluated compared to the other battleground states. But when you take a look at the trend lines across the board, things are starting to look a lot better for the vice president, and not to say that she's going to slam dunk the election or that she would be guaranteed victory on election day, but you'd much rather be in her position than the former president's if you're looking at the way that the polls are swinging. Because as you get through it, we also saw that today, Marist College released their polls in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania showing Kamala Harris with an advantage in every single state. Previously, they had shown some ties. In weeks prior, they had showed Donald Trump with an advantage, and so in their final set of polls for the cycle, they ended up being some of the most accurate in the Rust Belt in 22, saying Kamala Harris holds an advantage is something that matters. It makes a major difference in terms of our expectations and understandings of how the races might go. And when you start to see it in one pollster, then another pollster, then another pollster, then another pollster, to a point where it's skewing the average more beneficially to Kamala Harris, you really start to understand that where we are right now is definitively a better place for Kamala Harris than a week ago, or potentially even 2 weeks ago. Now, as we start to track the national numbers here, what we're also seeing is a tightening on the head-to-head nationwide popular vote. That Kamala Harris is just 1.2% ahead of Donald Trump when 2 weeks ago, she was ahead by double that. Now, granted, the popular vote doesn't actually make much of a difference when it comes down to who wins the election. Generally speaking, Democrats have to do better than where they are right now in order to win the cycle. But this race, I think, really is going to throw us all for a loop, not only in the popular vote, not only in the polling data, but also the popular vote, to what it actually needs to be for a Democratic victory. 2020 taught us a lesson that I don't know if it's applicable today, and that Democrats need to win by 4.5 to 5% nationally in order to win the Electoral College. Well, in the day and age of a post-Roe era and shifts in some safe Democratic states where Democrats don't have the means to combat it or just simply haven't allocated the resources to combat it, sure, there is something to be said. The Democrats are losing some ground support in states like California and New York and Florida, and that does bode poorly for the battleground districts there for Democrats in the House and Senate races and state legislative races, absolutely. But when it comes down to the national numbers, all it does really is shift the popular vote. Meanwhile, the swing states are just as close and in some cases better for Democrats than the national margin. And that's what's unlike the past election. You can see that in a number of these battleground states, they all voted to the left, the right actually of the national popular vote. Joe Biden won by 4.5% nationally, but you can see Wisconsin voted to the right of the national popular vote. Michigan voted to the right of the national popular vote. Pennsylvania voted to the right. North Carolina voted to the right. Obviously, Trump won it, but look at Georgia. Voted to the right. Nevada voted to the right. Arizona voted to the right. All of the states I've just mentioned all voted to the right of the national popular vote in the 2020 election. And so the lesson that was taken away from this was that there was no way Democrats could ever win a presidential election with the margin of victory in the popular vote that Hillary Clinton had, roughly 2.1%. It was sworn up and down that was simply impossible. But what Kamala Harris is proving today is that electoral viability isn't just determined by the national popular vote or what people across the country have to say about you, but rather a more targeted focus on these 7 battleground states that you are showing the biggest difference in the national popular vote versus swing state numbers, or smallest difference between the two, which is fascinating to say the least. Historically, again, very, very different results, very, very different outcomes. Democrats need to outperform nationally in previous electoral cycles. This time, it might be the opposite, where Kamala Harris can win Pennsylvania by 1.5, but only the national popular vote by 1.2. But it seems as if it isn't just the polls that are sort of getting grounded into this new reality that Kamala Harris is starting to do better. Even Polymarket, which I've started to trust a lot less now that it is entirely flooded by right-wing actors, people like Elon Musk are tweeting about it every single day, talking about it, about how this is the indicator for the election. A lot of Republicans jumped onto the Polymarket, website very, very close to the election. And so it's very interesting to see just how much money has been put into these betting markets in the final stretch. And a lot of it has been directly fueled by people like right-wing actors who go out on social media and say, if Donald Trump is up in this forecast, he wins the election. And so thus, they invest in him and they want to cash in on that. And they're being told, well, if Polymarket says that Trump is winning, he's winning. So they invest more money in that Trump is winning. And it's a self-reinforcing cycle that ends up deluding people into believing that Polymarket is going to be this neutral arbiter on it. Previously, I did say that I thought the betting markets provided some insight when they weren't being, in a way hijacked by these right-wing actors who looked at it and said, this is an opportunity for me to use this as a marketing ploy, for me to get people to invest their money, to say that this is the way that we set up the expectations for Donald Trump's victory. If you notice anything about conservative media, a lot of them point to the betting markets now rather than anything like polls, anything like forecasts, anything that might show them doing more poorly than what people betting their actual money are saying about this race. But Polymarket, regardless whether or not Donald Trump is going to win the election or not, has seen some change in direction in favor of the vice president, gaining 5% overnight. And again, back to this point of getting more grounded in reality, because the numbers they're seeing out of some of these states just simply aren't that exciting. And another thing, too, is when you see things like On Message, which is a Republican pollster. They do a lot of internals for the GOP. They showed us some results for the 2024 cycle, Republican internals that show Kamala Harris down 2 in Pennsylvania, 1 in Wisconsin, 3 in Arizona, and tied in Michigan. These are Republican internals. They should be showing Republicans ahead in every battleground state. There shouldn't be even a single iteration of the poll that shows Kamala Harris winning or tied in any battleground state, and that really does make a difference. I do think, though, that there's merit in believing that the race is close and that it is a 2-3-point race, 1-point race, half-point race for whoever actually wins these battleground states. But previously, what we saw, for example, in 2022, was that some of the Republican internals, a good example is, the recent poll, Echelon Insights. They did one in the state of Georgia back in 2022. I believe it was Echelon Insights or it was another firm. Either way, Republican aligned. They released one this time saying that, Democrats were down about 6 points in the state of one of the battleground states. You flash back to 2022, they predicted that the Republican who ended up losing that race was going to win by 5.6 points. And so, again, very much feels like we could be in for a repeat of the 2022 midterms. It's starting to indicate that the Rust Belt is moving back in the direction that is favorable for Kamala Harris. We're seeing a lot of negative press on behalf of Donald Trump. Back in 2016, if you remember the coverage there, it was a lot of negative on Hillary Clinton. The James Comey investigation reopened all these emails, all these things, all these considerations. People forgot about Access Hollywood. People forgot about X, Y, and Z, and they more focused on Hillary Clinton's negatives. We are 4 days out. There does not seem to be a single negative piece about the vice president, and that's because she has stayed consistent and on message. Joe Biden's comment Joe Biden's comment that was taken as calling half of the country, quote unquote, garbage. Obviously, when it comes down to the modern era and digital clipping and taking things in and out of context, I mean, you're going to find that people are going to take comments like those and run away with it. Regardless, it didn't matter to the voters, right? It might have enraged the MAGA base, but at the end of the day, Joe Biden's not the candidate. It didn't receive as much national coverage, and that is really the only negative story Democrats have seen over the past week. There is quite literally nothing else. No gaffes, no mix-ups, no incorrect messaging on behalf of Governor Walz, Gwen Walz, the First Lady of Minnesota, Doug Emhoff, the second gentleman, or the vice president, because they are on top of things, and it really much seems that they are running a very strong and tight-knit campaign. And when it comes down to what we're seeing in the data, Kamala Harris leads in Wisconsin by 0.8. A week ago, she was up 0.2. While it may not seem that different, 0.6% is the exact margin and change here, the exact margin that Biden won by in the last election. And so an improvement of that amount gives buffer room for maybe some inaccuracies in the data. In Michigan, too, a week ago, Kamala Harris led in the state by 0.4%. Today, she leads by a point. May not be massive, and it isn't a massive swing enough to say this is saving her in the election, but it's showing the direction is moving the right way for the vice president. In a very close and tight race, we know everything's going to come down to just thousands of votes, a handful of votes, going to make a massive difference dependent on just how a few people in a few pockets and sects of some of these battleground states decide to vote and how they decide to vote. All of these things make a difference. All of these things really change how the state's going to vote at large. But again, you don't ignore numbers when they move in the right direction for Kamala Harris. And the only real sign here that the numbers are moving away from her come down to Nevada, and that's because of a 6-point lead here from Susquehanna University. They did a poll in the state showing Donald Trump with a 6-point lead, but some other very reputable sources too. For example, Noble Predictive Insights, which does a great job at predicting Arizona and Nevada, have Kamala Harris up in Nevada. YouGov, The Times, Kamala Harris up by 1 point. Data for Progress conducted their last polls of the cycle, Kamala Harris up by 2. And even Trafalgar, which is notorious for having way higher overestimations for Republicans in battleground states, even they are saying Nevada is a tie. And what do we know historically? Nevada has always overestimated Republican support in the state. In 2016, the polls said, even though they were wrong in favor of Hillary Clinton in many states, Nevada was not one of those. The polls said that Hillary Clinton would lose Nevada to Donald Trump by 1 point. She not only won the state, she won it by 2.4. In 2018, they said Dean Heller, the Republican senator, would win the Senate race. They said that the Republican nominee for governor there would win the Senate race. For the governor's race in Nevada. In both instances, Democrats won. In 2020, the polls said that Trump would win in the state of Nevada. Biden won. You also saw, too, when it came down to a number of statewide races in 22, they overestimated Republican support quite significantly. In fact, I can just flash us back to the 2022 cycle. When you take a look at the Senate races, this is a really good example of why I got jaded based on some of these numbers here. Adam Laxalt had a last-minute surge in the state, was up 1.4%. All the polls, major polls, just Trafalgar said Laxalt would be up by 5. Remember that. Data for Progress said Laxalt would be up by 2. They now say Harris is up by 2. Keep in mind, all of these firms here, only one in particular, showed Catherine Cortez Masto with a 1-point lead with roughly 10%, 11% of the electorate undecided. So I went with the data points that seemed to direct me in saying that Adam Laxalt was going to win by 1.4%. And it was a standard thing, too. You saw it in Pennsylvania. The numbers changed in the very last minute. Very beneficial for the GOP, all of it. Ended up being a nothing burger. Democrats won in Nevada. They won in Pennsylvania. Georgia is a great example, too, of how that last minute change here, and these are runoff numbers, but when you take a look at the preliminary data leading to that runoff, what does it say? Right? Warnock is up in some, but then you took a look at others, right? More information, Herschel Walker internal, Walker's up by 5. Echelon Insights, Walker up by 4, Walker up by 7. Amber Integrated, Walker up by 3, Walker up by 4. A tie. Data for Progress, that other one that shows Harris up by 2, showed Walker up by 1, right? Again, so really it just comes down to which polls you believed and trusted, but at the end of the day, there are some very clear distinctions here that said, hey, wait a minute, Donald Trump is going to win, or Donald Trump's endorsed candidates are going to win these states, and in fact, in many cases, he simply did not. Well, I will say, when it comes down to states like Georgia, we've seen slight shifts away from Donald Trump, right? 1.8 being reduced to 1.5. He still holds the advantage in some states, right? When you look at my electoral map and my prediction, I gave Donald from Georgia, I gave him Arizona. I think there's a reason for that. I think there's genuine reason to say, he holds the advantage in some of these states. But ultimately, over the past 5 days, the numbers that have been released have started to show Kamala Harris winning back that Biden coalition of 2020. Whether it's the Virginia numbers coming on par with what it was in 2020, or New Hampshire showing a 1-point improvement, or Nebraska second showing a 4-point improvement, or Minnesota showing a 1-point improvement. any improvement from 2020 is phenomenal news for Kamala Harris because she actually has some wiggle room relative to that cycle because Biden won 306 electoral votes. But ultimately, where we are today in a number of these reputable polls tell us that Kamala Harris could be winning the election today. Not that she will, not that it will be a landslide, but that she has a very strong chance of winning. And in this position right now, if you're looking at it from an objective standpoint, in this closing argument stage, you would much rather be the vice president than the former president, even though it's still close and competitive and ultimately could swing either way. But Kamala Harris today wins the day with the upper hand in improvements in polls across the battlegrounds. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter at the top left of the screen. There's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.